What if I told you the most profitable full-service chain in America by sales per location doesn't sell steaks, they don't sell sushi, they actually sell soup dumplings. This is Din Tai Fung. They average more than $27 million per restaurant in the US, nearly double what the next best chain makes. And they do that all without any flashy marketing, massive menus, but with discipline, patience, and hospitality so systematized, it looks effortless. Today, we're gonna peel back the story of Din Tai Fung, how the tiny Taiwanese oil shop with 4 tables upstairs turned into a Michelin-starred, globally celebrated brand. And along the way, I'm gonna show you the invisible 30% rule system they use, which is a training, leadership, and systems that you can copy and make in your own restaurant to scale without collapsing. Now, here's what you'll learn. Number 1, the milestones that built Din Tai Fung piece by piece. Number 2, the trial and errors that they went through and the pivots that shaped their playbook. And Number 3, how their invisible systems of hospitality mapped out directly to make them as successful as they are, a $26 million per unit brand. So let's start at the very beginning. It's Taipei, Taiwan, 1958, post-war recovery. Refugees and immigrants are pouring in from mainland China. The streets are crowded, noisy, full of scooters, open-air markets, hawkers shouting over one another. It's not glamorous, it's survival. A young man named Yang Bing Yai had fled the Shaanxi province a decade earlier. He had nothing but grit. He was delivering cooking oil from a bicycle from a shop called Din Tai Fung. Day in and day out, all he did was pedal around tons of heavy buckets and tins of oil across Taipei. And he made no money, but it was steady. At the shop, he met a young woman named Lei Pan Mi, who would later become his wife and business partner. But after years of deliveries and savings, he was just saving and saving and saving after delivering tons and tons and tons of oil, hard freaking work for very little to no money. The two decided to open their own shop, and they called it Din Tai Fung, a mashup of their supplier Din Mei Oils and the shop where Yang had worked, Din Tai Fung. This was no restaurant. There was no dumplings, no food, just tiny storefronts stacked with tins, ledger books, and long days of going up and down the stairs. They lived in a cramped apartment right above the shop. Downstairs, they tried to carve out a living. For years, this was their world, oil deliveries, counting coins. No one outside of Taipei never knew their names. But then the market shifted. By the late 1960s, tin oils had arrived. Convenience, mass production. Suddenly, customers didn't need to buy oil by the scoop from their neighborhood shops. They could just buy sealed tins in their grocery store. For Din Tai Fung, this was a death sentence. Their little shop was losing relevance by the day. The Yangs watched their sales shrink. They had a choice, close up shop or reinvent. This is where resilience shows up. This is where innovation shows up. This is what I talk about all the time with restaurant owners. You have to be resilient. A problem usually becomes a better solution, but you have to find that solution and be resilient. Don't just placate into the problem or accept defeat. Find the solution, and that's what they did here. So instead of folding, they looked to pivot. A friend from Shanghai gave them an idea: sell delicate soup dumplings. In Shanghai, these were common. In Taiwan, they were not. And Yang had a work ethic and the wife that had the discipline, and they both had the desperation to try. So in 1972, they converted half of their shop into a kitchen. 4 tables, a tiny team. Upstairs, they still lived in a small, cramped apartment. But downstairs, something magical started happening. They hand-rolled dough. They measured fillings. They folded carefully. At first, this was just a survival food, another way to make a quick buck, something for survival while they figured out what they were gonna do. But word got around. Neighbors told neighbors, word of mouth. The dumplings weren't just good, they were extraordinary. The wrappers, they still held their broth. The broth burst in your mouth. A product so delicate and precise that you could taste the discipline in every bite. Slowly, oils disappeared from their shelves. They stopped selling that. Dumplings took over. By the mid-1970s, Din Tai Fung was no longer an oil shop. It was a dumpling restaurant. The milestone had occurred. So in 1958, they opened the oil shop. Milestone number 2, 1972, pivots to dumpling. 2 steps, right? You gotta remember that. That was 15 years apart. This was a long making of this big, giant corporation, this big, giant restaurant group. Both born from survival, right? Survival, adapt, and perfection. That would define everything that would come in later on. Now, here's what's critical. The Yangs didn't just sell dumplings. They created an experience. They believed every customer deserved to feel cared for. Even if it was just for 4 tables, that small, tiny, cramped restaurant they had, they took it personal and made sure that every guest had an amazing experience. That was their true obsession, right? They greeted guests personally. Lei inspected every dumpling. Mistakes weren't tolerated, period. It was all about perfection. If a wrapper was torn, it wouldn't reach the table. They didn't have systems written down, but they had standards. And standards became habits, habits became the culture, and that's where the seed of hospitality started sprouting. Not smiling because managers tell you to smile, but smiling because you believe the guests deserve the best version of yourself. This was early DNA of Din Tai Fung and their philosophies. Product obsessed, but they obsessed about the guest even more. This is what made the 4 tables downstairs into a brand worthy of waiting for. They had lines out the door. For the next 20 years, Din Tai Fung stayed small. 2 decades later, it's early 1990s, Din Tai Fung is still a modest little shop on the roads of Taipei. 4 tables, no neon signs, no PR team, just a line that never seems to end and a reputation that's starting to cross oceans. And that's when it happened. 1993, the New York Times runs an article by celebrating the chef and food critic Ken Ham, naming Din Tai Fung one of the top 10 gourmet restaurants in the world. Think about that. A humble Taiwanese dumpling shop sharing the same stage as the world's most famous French fine dining houses. 4 tables, they're living upstairs, a staff of just a handful of people ranked among the very best restaurants on earth. That article flipped a switch for them. Suddenly, international travelers were flying to Taipei just to eat at their restaurant. Business people were taking layovers, foodies were chasing stories. Taiwanese locals who'd maybe taken Din Tai Fung for granted suddenly saw their little neighborhood spot crowned a global star. Lines grew longer, reservations became impossible, and the Yang family now faced in a new kind of pressure. Most operators in that moment would have cashed in, right? They would have just opened up 5 more locations and then capital would start knocking, franchisers would come in, they would just capitalize in every which way possible. And they knew opportunity was calling everywhere, but the Yangs didn't do that. They didn't capitalize in that way. Instead, they made the opposite choice that 99% of people would make, and they stayed small for years. They were offered deals left and right, make no mistake about it, but they said no. Why? Because they're obsessed with quality and quality over growth. They believed that fame without discipline would ruin them, and they were right. This lesson was one of the first great lessons of the Din Tai Fung family. Not every opportunity is a good opportunity. Scaling broken systems doesn't multiply success, it multiplies chaos. So they refined and they tightened up their SOPs. They kept training cooks even longer. They codified recipes. They enforced standards until they became second nature. They prepared silently for the moment that they would finally expand. So 3 years after the New York Times recognition in 1996, Din Tai Fung took its first cautious step overseas to Tokyo, Japan. Why Japan? Because Japan shared their obsession with precision, with discipline, with craft. They knew the Japanese would absolutely appreciate what they were doing. And Japanese diners valued consistency and transparency, which is exactly what Din Tai Fung built in its reputation. But here's the kicker. When they opened in Tokyo, they didn't just send a brand manual, right? They didn't just send people to open it or send new staff. They personally, from Taipei, came over and trained everyone in Japan for a whole entire year before even opening. Managers shadowed the Yang family in Taipei. Recipes were guarded like blueprints. The Tokyo restaurant became a smash hit instantly when it opened because of this. It proved that Din Tai Fung could survive outside of Taipei in one of the toughest culinary markets in the world. This was milestone number 3. So now 1993, they have global fame via the New York Times. Milestone number 4, first overseas branch in Tokyo. These are 2 moments. One gave them a name, the other gave them confidence. Very, very important milestone. So by the year 2000, Din Tai Fung was ready for another leap. Now, think about this. This is only 25 years ago. And this time they wanted to leap halfway across the world to the United States. The Yang family chose Arcadia, California, a Los Angeles suburb with a large Taiwanese and Chinese American community. This wasn't an accident. They knew that to succeed in America, they needed both authenticity and a built-in audience who already understood the product. On opening day, March 20th of 2000, the little Arcadia restaurant had only about 50 seats. The lines were out the door already. Local food writers praised it, the Asian American community embraced it, and they said it tasted just like at home. But here's what's interesting. Arcadia wasn't just an instant success story, it was also a trial ground. American kitchens had different labor rules. Ingredients had to be sourced differently, training times had to be adjusted. For the Yangs, this wasn't just about expansion, it was a laboratory. Every challenge became another system. Every hiccup became another SOP. It worked. Arcadia became a cult phenomenon. Celebrities came in, food critics lined up out the door, and most importantly, the product matched Taipei. Dumplings folded with 18 pleats. broth bursting in the mouth, service fast, friendly, and exact. Milestone number 5 is finally reached. In 2000, the first US store opens in Arcadia. And now let's be honest, not everything was perfect, okay? The US expansion forced some adjustments. Some suppliers couldn't meet the standards, early staff turnover, some guests got inconsistent service, and eventually the original Arcadia location closed in 2020 after 20 years, partly because the space was just too small for the operations of Din Tai Fung and its demand. But here's the difference. Din Tai Fung treated every misstep as data. Instead of scaling recklessly, they slowed down, fixed the problem, and then moved forward. That's why, unlike so many chains that burn bright and die fast, Din Tai Fung slowly grew and still commands lines and still prints $27 million per location per year. By early 2000s, Din Tai Fung had fame, had discipline, and proof that it could travel across countries and across cultures. Tokyo was thriving, Arcadia was thriving, and offers to expand were coming in every direction. Singapore, Hong Kong, Southeast Asia, even Australia, but there was the question. Could they systematize not just the dumpling, but the entire guest experience? That's what they're obsessed with. Could they protect the hospitality across continents? Every restaurant says they care about consistency, but Din Tai Fung actually cared about consistency. It wasn't just a slogan, it was actually the religion. When you bite into a Din Tai Fung bao, right, a soup dumpling in Taipei, in Tokyo, in Los Angeles, or now in New York cities, it is supposed to feel the same. The skin thin and delicate, the pleats perfectly formed, the broth bursting hot but balanced, the filling tender and juicy. That's not just luck, that's not just talented chefs, that's systems with Din Tai Fung, not just a restaurant, an empire. So let's start with the dumpling itself. Din Tai Fung is famous for its golden ratio. Each soup dumpling is 21 grams in total weight, 16 grams of filling, and 5 grams of dough. And each one is folded exactly 18 times with 18 pleats. Not 17, not 19, 18. This was codified by founder Yang Bingying himself. He didn't want close enough. He wanted perfection. He believed the wrapper should be so thin you could see the light through it, but strong enough to hold the broth without breaking. Now, think about what that means. Operationally, it means every dumpling chef is trained to measure by touch, by eye, by repetition. It means that line checks are done. It means if the dumpling is underweight or if it breaks in the basket, it never reaches a guest. Imagine that. Most restaurants are worried about whether the fries are coming out hot or not, right? Din Tai Fung's worried about milligrams of dough. That's the standard. So how do you teach this? Here's the secret. Din Tai Fung invests more in training than almost anybody else in the industry. In the US, dumpling chefs are trained for 12 weeks before they even get close to the line. And full mastery can take 6 months to a year. Every US restaurant has a dumpling training manager. That's right, a salaried role dedicated just to training dumpling makers. That's how serious they are about training. It doesn't stop there, because a head chef role can take up to 3 years of continuous training and even testing. Every recipe is standardized. Every prep is documented. Think about the cultural discipline this creates. If you're a cook at Din Tai Fung, you're not just slinging dumplings, you're entering a craft school. You're earning credentials. That's a sense of discipline, of apprenticeship that bleeds into the culture of the restaurant. But here's where it gets genius. Din Tai Fung doesn't just hide the process in the back, it's on display. Their kitchens are behind glass walls. So you can literally watch teams of chefs folding dumplings in real time. White uniforms, surgical precision, row after row of tray lined with identical dumplings. This is hospitality as a theater. It's transparency that builds trust. The guest doesn't have to wonder if the food is clean, if the chefs care, if the standards are there. They can actually see it with their own eyes. It's also a marketing engine. Every tourist who films dumpling folding on their phone creates free marketing, free advertising. Din Tai Fung turned their SOPs into a show. Now, let's talk service, hospitality experience, because product alone doesn't explain a $27 million per location. Hospitality matters. Din Tai Fung doesn't just train staff in tasks, but in choreography. From the greeting at the door, to how water is poured, to how tables are touched, to how managers circulate, nothing is left to chance. In Taiwan, employees literally fill out weekly wellness forms about their physical and mental state, so managers can assign them duties accordingly. In the US, staff are trained in specific scripts for welcoming guests, explaining dishes, and responding to problems. Even guest recovery is systematized. If a dumpling breaks, if a ticket is late, If a guest has an issue, there is a ladder of authority and script for the fixing of it. The goal is not just to solve the problem, the goal is to make the guest feel cared for even more than they ever expected. This is why reviews across markets echo the same theme: worth every penny, perfectly choreographed, every detail thought through. Hospitality doesn't happen by chance, it's built in the DNA of an operation. This is what I keep telling restaurant owners and they don't listen, right? This is a $27 million solution. So what happens when you combine these three pillars of product and precision, training, investment into hospitality, and choreographing everything all along the way? You get a culture at Din Tai Fung, cooks that don't cut corners because the systems won't let them, servers don't wing it because they're trained so well and their training already tells them what to do and how to do it. Managers don't just manage shifts, they actually lead. They enforce a living playbook. This is why their per unit revenue is astronomical. Guests line up for 2 hours because they know exactly what they're gonna get every single time. This is also why Din Tai Fung can expand across continents. They didn't scale food, they scaled standards, they scaled systems, they scaled hospitality. So by the mid-2000s, with systems in place, Din Tai Fung was ready to grow faster than they ever had. And so they cracked the code on how to protect quality across countries. So look, bottom line is Din Tai Fung makes $27 million per unit, which is absolutely crazy. There's one right by my house and there's lines out the door every single time I go. You cannot go to save time. You wanna try and go on a Tuesday at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, there's still a freaking line. Doesn't matter, right? Why is it like that? Well, that story is to tell you exactly what it was. They are obsessed with consistency. They're obsessed with guest experience. They could have said, we want to be consistent and we can just open QSRs or we can just deliver food and scripted hospitality, but instead they are hospitable. They deliver hospitality at a high level, but they make it consistent through systems, right? Systems, training, and leadership. They have training systems in place, but then they also have leadership in there to make sure that the leadership upholds the systems that they've created. It's not enough to train the staff. It's not enough to have the systems. You have to have the leadership there as well. They have a leadership development system where they actually develop their managers into leaders. If you're not a leader already, you will become one. They move up like crazy in their locations because they build loyalty, because they're consistent with their staff. It lowers turnover rate dramatically when you give them consistency, right? You give them the right training, the right systems. And the top 3 reasons people leave a business, number 1 is poor leadership, number 2 is poor training, and number 3 is lack of growth. But Din Tai Fung addresses all of that. They have great leadership, they have great training, and then they have great growth because they actually move up their staff through that training process, which is so important. You can go from busser to leadership, no problem, very common, as long as you're dedicated, bought in, and willing to do the work. And so they do that. This is what I keep telling restaurant owners all the time. If you want to be successful, you have to have leadership, training, and systems. That develops a culture of excellence, but you have to have all 3. You can't have one without the other. They all have to coexist. First, start with leadership, then start with training, then develop systems. Leadership has to be there, number 1, in order to implement what you create, right? You have to have it. Then you can create the training, then you can create the systems around the training. So if you're serious about being successful in your brand, if you're serious about scaling, if you want to go from 1 location to 5 or 5 locations to 15 or 15 to 50, this is what it takes, right? If you really want to take things to the next level, if you want to be as successful as you can possibly be and make sure that you give the guests the best experience possible, you're known for being the best or at least having the culture of excellence, you start with leadership, develop training and systems behind that.